waiting on George.
Me too.
Yeah, that's.
Okay. All right, good. Okay, are all of our jurors back?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Your Honor, the state would like to address the court on a motion.
Yes.
After consideration over lunch, and it was a hard thought consideration, we would move to strike the juror who was just in here being questioned by the court. She has indicated that she's already leaning in one direction, which means she's forming opinion, she's considering the evidence and doing exactly what she's been instructed not to do. It's misconduct. If she had said she's leaning towards guilt, you would strike them in a heartbeat if they moved. And also, she said it in guilt phase, she was leaning towards guilt, or towards death, excuse me. She says she's leaning towards life, and we thought about it. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, but I just can't. I can't risk that as representative of the state and advocating for the state. She's engaged in misconduct. So we would move to strike her for cause.
Absolutely not. She indicated that she was keeping an open mind, that she indicated that she wasn't going to make any decisions until the state had a chance to rebut the mitigating evidence presented by the defense. She did candidly say she was leaning one way, but it made it more than abundantly clear that she had not formed any decisions, that she was keeping an open mind and was going to hear everything before she made her vote.
And absolutely misconduct. There's no evidence of misconduct whatsoever.
And there's no evidence of misconduct.
I heard Mr. Birnbaum.
How's that not misconduct? I'm sorry, but
Well,
how's
listen,
that not
at this point in
misconduct?
time, listen, let me think about it, okay? After the state puts on their rebuttal, I may have to bring her one more time, just to have a real heart-to-heart with her.
And Judge, it's not, and the reason I didn't ask any other questions of her was because I didn't want her to think that I was the one who initiated this, or that I was interrogating her in case she ends up on the panel. At the time, I wasn't sure what we were going to do. So, and we both discussed it and thought about it over lunch.
Well, and Mr. Harmon's point is probably well taken, that if she had said that she was leaning towards death, but listen, I'm just going to think about it. And before we send her back, I'm probably going to bring her in one more time for a heart-to-heart, and if she tells us that even though she at one point was leaning, but nonetheless she can listen to all of the evidence and make a decision, then I'll be satisfied.
And what I would ask then is at that point, let's not ask her which way she's leaning.
No, that wasn't, no one asked her.
No, I understand.
That was an unsolicited response that just came out, and I would never ask her that.
Right.
And I would only compliment her for doing that. She did exactly what she was
Yes, she
supposed
did.
to do.
She absolutely did. So
That's
let's,
one of the reasons I thought about not even making this one.
I understand.
But, Your Honor, I just want to let the court know, I didn't mean any disrespect, that I was trying to anticipate the defense arguments, and I didn't, about you would strike her if she said she was late.
No, and you are accurate, really,
I
because,
think you wouldn't have a choice, honestly.
well, as they teach us in judicial college, okay, anyway, most likely that's true. I would have. So, anyway, let's go ahead and keep going. All right, defendant's present, defense is present, state's present. Let's go bring him in.
Okay, everybody ready?
All right, welcome back, everyone. We're ready to proceed. State call your first witness in rebuttal.
Your Honor, the state calls Dr. Lawrence Holder.
Still help you God.
Yes, I do.
Stuff going on.
Thank you. Oh,
Good afternoon.
hello.
Hello. May it please the court, would you please state your full name and spell your names, both of them, for us?
Okay. Lawrence Holder, Lawrence
Thank you, sir. Sir, how are you employed?
I do a lot of things. I work part-time at UF Health Jacksonville. teaching and seeing patients. I do some educational things for drug companies, and I do some core laboratory work, which is interpreting images as part of drug trials.
All right. And when you said UF doctor, that's University of Florida, obviously.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, no, that's okay. It's a common short-term name for, or short name for UF Florida. Doctor, what areas of medicine do you specialize in?
I'm board certified in both diagnostic radiology and nuclear medicine.
Can you tell the jurors your educational background?
I went to college at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. I went to a medical school at Washington University in St. Louis. I interned in medicine there. I then was in the service at an environmental radiation laboratory in Nevada and switched from internal medicine to radiology and nuclear medicine, and ended up going to the University of Cincinnati for residency and fellowship. And then I went to Baltimore and took my first job.
And your fellowship was in nuclear medicine or radiology?
Well, radiology was the residency program. After you do medical school, you do an internship, and then there are residency programs, and I did diagnostic radiology. And after that, I did some additional specialty work in a nuclear medicine program, both of which lead to board certification.
And have you previously testified as an expert in the areas of radiology and nuclear medicine?
Yes, I have.
Approximately how many times?
Probably over the years, 20.
Okay. And is that in multiple county court or county or circuits here in the state of Florida?
Yes.
All right. And have you testified in front of juries and in front of judges as far as like motion hearings and whatnot?
Yes.
Your Honor, I would tender Dr. Holder as an expert in the area of radiology and nuclear medicine.
I don't have any questions at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Doctor, are you familiar with both PET scans and different forms of MRI analysis?
Yes, I am.
All right. PET scans, what are PET scans? First of all, what are they?
I think I saw some prior testimony, so I think the jury's seen a lot of stuff. But a PET scan is simply a radioactive material that's given to the patient, and we use some cameras called scanners to take some images, and then those images are reconstructed and you look at them. And a PET scan is generic. There are lots of different tracers or radioisotopes that you give the patients, and different ones do different things. And the PET scan is the name for the scanner called positron emission tomography.
Positron emission tomography.
Yes.
And clinically, for the diagnosis of either medical illnesses or ailments, what is it utilized for in the clinical setting?
Well, it's used actually primarily, probably 85%, is for cancer diagnosis of various types. People know about breast cancer and lung cancer and so forth. We then use it also in certain kinds of cardiac diagnoses, and we also use it in some brain areas.
Okay, what brain areas is it utilized in?
Well, the one that's primarily used almost exclusively is in certain dementia settings, predominantly to define Alzheimer's dementia compared to other kinds of dementia. It's used occasionally in epilepsy to find the focus of the patient's seizure so they can act on it. Occasionally it's used if someone's had surgery for brain cancer and they see something on a MR or CT and can't tell whether it's a scar or a recurrent cancer. We'll use PET scanning for that.
Okay. Now, is PET scans, is it something that can be used clinically to diagnose personality problems or non-specific brain injury?
No.
Can it be used to confirm neuropsychological testing or neuropsychological results?
No, it's not used in those areas at all. I mean, there's research being done. It's a research tool, of course, but clinically, none of those areas are accepted clinical indications in patients, human beings.
So, if I'm understanding you right, in the scientific community of radiologists and nuclear medicine doctors, PET scans are not used and that they are not approved for use for diagnosis of personality problems or non-specific brain damage or injury.
That's correct.
Are there any national societies or insurance companies that have criteria or case management algorithms that use PET for those purposes?
No.
Are there any diagnostic or specific diagnostic criteria to make diagnosis of that type, personality disorders or specific brain injury with a PET scan?
None at all.
Now, MRIs, what are MRIs or MRs?
Again, everyone's familiar with x-rays, where you have an x-ray that goes through and you take a picture of your chest or whatever. And a CT scan is an x-ray where you go around the body and you take images of the tissue that's there and it recreates slices. An MR is an imaging technique that takes advantage of the fact that atoms in the body are mostly made up of water, but hydrogen ions, and atoms have something called magnetic spin, and you put the patient in something. You know how Etch-a-Sketch, how you have that Etch-a-Sketch thing and the magnet makes the little metal things line up? Well, you go into a magnet, literally, and some of your cells line up, not all of them, but they line up, do something, a radio frequency pulse, and it knocks them out of alignment, and I'm getting too detailed. I mean, it's just another imaging technique that images tissue based on the hydrogen content of the tissue.
What are MRIs used for commonly clinically?
They're actually used for a lot of things because they have the ability to separate subtle differences in tissue better than CT or regular X-ray. So you talk about the football players who have the MRs of the knee after Sunday's football or of the shoulder, because it can show you differences in the muscle and the tendons, and it's used for that. It's used really in the brain because the brain has different tissues. It's used really, you can go through the whole body for certain abdominal things, pelvic things, prostate cancer, a whole variety of things like that.
What's it used for when you're dealing with the brain?
Well, it's wonderful for the brain, MR, and again, we're using MR generically because there are lots of little types of things, but it's used basically to look for aberrations or abnormalities in the tissue. And so whether it's caused by a stroke, by a tumor, by a bullet wound, it's used to look at the tissue of the brain, and for almost everything you can think of, from infection, tumor, etc.
All right. Is it utilized clinically, and is it accepted as a scientifically reliable use to diagnose personality problems or nonspecific brain injury?
No.
Doctor, are you aware of the work in this case by Dr. Wu?
Yes.
All right. And did Dr. Wu provide you with his with the slides and the scans that he examined?
Yes.
Have you examined them?
Yes.
All right. So let me talk to you about those first. My next question after that, and I don't want to scare anybody, but you have prepared a PowerPoint. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And is it limited? Is it under 30 slides?
I think so.
Okay. All right. Were you provided with PET scans, in this case from the defendant's head?
I was provided with some images of the scan from Dr. Wu, yes.
All right. And what would be your diagnosis looking at those PET scans?
Normal.
Okay. And were you provided any kind of MRI images or MR images?
I was not provided any MR images. I was provided some data from diffusion tensor imaging, and I was provided some numbers from a volumetric analysis program. I was not provided with the original images.
Are you familiar with either of those things?
Yes.
All right. And with what you're provided, are you able to make, or is any clinician able to make any kind of diagnosis, reference, personality problems, or nonspecific brain injury?
No. I mean, these techniques are research techniques that are being used, but when you have an individual patient, there's nothing that you find in which there are diagnostic criteria to say this patient has a personality problem or whatever.
That's just not commonly accepted in the scientific community of radiologists or nuclear medicine doctors?
It's not even uncommonly accepted.
It's not accepted at all?
That's correct.
All right, so you've prepared a PowerPoint. Have you included some of the slides from Dr. Wu's PowerPoint?
Almost all of them
Okay.
are from his. I've just done a few. There are a lot of slides in that, and I just took a few, and I did it because you wanted me to tell what I thought about what he said, so I just picked out a few to highlight areas where I disagree with what he said or where I think what he said is not accurate.
Okay, all right. Is this the PowerPoint that's loaded up over your right-hand shoulder?
Yes.
Now, let me ask you, do you need to mark on the slide in any way as we're going through the
Well,
slide?
I'd point out something. I mean, I'm not going to give I'm not going to teach like I was teaching residents, but I want to point, if I say something, I want people to see what I'm saying, so.
Let's try this. Let's move through it, and if you can't reach something on the
Okay.
screen to point, you can come down here, and if you look up there, it has a interactive screen to it, so where I've just scribbled on there.
Okay.
That's what Mr. Harmon did.
Yeah, like I'm just circling this right here.
Okay.
So we have the clicker, right? Oh, here it is. Okay. So I don't know if you want to control this to go through it.
Well, I'll just, you can control it, or I
Okay.
can change
Just tell me if you want me to
It's
change
just
the slide.
very simple.
What is it about this slide that was significant or you needed to discuss?
Well, this came from Dr. Wu, and it's just the images from the slide, and I'm sure he told you that we get the information from the patient, the radioactive materials in the patient. It's going to the brain cells because it's glucose, putting out little blips of energy. We take a picture, and then the computer cuts it. It's like taking a picture of a loaf of bread, and then the computer makes slices, and you pull out each slice. And the slices in this slide go from the bottom up towards the top. So, okay, it's lying like this, and there's slices. Okay? And you see the different parts of the brain. And when we look at this, excuse me, when we look at this, we are looking for certain things. And all I want you to appreciate is if you look, let's say here at the top, you're looking here, for instance, on this slice. You can't really read the numbers here. But if you're looking at this, you know your brain, everyone talks about the left brain and the right brain, and you have, it's like two halves of a grapefruit together. These two halves, if you look here in the front, are right next to each other. The reason I'm pointing that out is there's no volume loss. This brain has a good amount of brain tissue, and it's good volume. Turns out, as you get a little older, I don't want to scare you, but older's like 35 to 40, we begin to lose a little brain tissue. So as you get a little older, you can see little stuff. But this is really right up next to each other. Similarly, low down in the brain, this is called the thalamus, it's right next to each other. So there's no volume loss. The next thing I want to point out in the normal brain, you can see these areas of bright and dark and bright and dark. That's those called sulci and gyri. If you had a picture of a brain, like so you can Google normal brain, and there are crevices like this, and so there's tissue and then areas of not tissue. To emphasize something interesting, if you look up at the top here, the second image, you see these two vertical lines, and then there's two on this side. What that means is those are eye muscles, because when you give the glucose, most of the time you give it with a patient lying in a quiet room, and then for an hour the material's in the blood and it gets taken up by the tissues that are using the glucose. Well, if he's not laying as quietly as you'd like, and he's reading or looking around, he's using his eye muscles, and the eye muscles take up a little more tracer. So that just gives you an idea, the point being normal.
I was going to ask, is there anything abnormal that any of these slides?
Normal.
No tumors, no kind of brain damage?
Nothing that we see. Now,
this slide, if you could just tell us the significance.
well, Dr. Wu said PET scans are advanced techniques and they're better. It's a wonderful technique, okay? PET is wonderful. But he said it shows regional brain function. The PET scan does not show function. It's showing you glucose being taken up by a cell, because the cell is alive and all cells use energy, some more than others. So it shows glucose. It tells you nothing about function.
All right, the next scan, or the next slide.
Now, PET is wonderful, okay? It's been used now for 20 years. It gets more sophisticated every day. And there are thousands of articles around to study brain function. But it's a majority of it is research tools. And we'll show you some. But it's research papers. There are a few well-defined clinical indications, which I mentioned, epilepsy and dementia.
Now, I know we talked about other uses in the body. Is it used in cardiology to check function of the heart or to look for things in the heart?
It is used in the heart for certain things. Again, the principle being with FDG, which is the tracer we're talking about, is the heart muscle, hopefully your heart muscle's beating and it's alive, and we use it to see areas that are more alive or less alive because they're using more or less energy. Normal. Next case.
Next one? Okay.
Yeah. Now, what Dr. Wu also shows, and these are right from Dr. Wu, what Dr. Wu shows, and he uses color, you noticed I used black and white, and you could see some of that detail. When you use color, the detail tends to get blurred out, and people use it for a variety of reasons, but he takes this data and puts it through a statistical program. And I guess he talked to you about his program, which is one that he and another guy developed about 30 years ago, and we don't know much about it. It's not a commercially available program, and we don't know much about his database, and unless you ask me, I don't need to go into that, but it's his personal database, and he tries to compare the distribution of the isotope to, quote, a normal person. And he says, you see a few of these black dots, those are areas that my program says are abnormal.
You're quoting him.
Yeah, I mean, that's what he says. Now, it turns out that, let me show you the next slide,
okay,
which is also from his reporting. This is his. This is one of those images from the original normal. You can see the difference. And he says, you see this circle that he's drawn here, this oval? He says, this area is different than the normal, he says it's 2.84 standard deviations from the normal. And then he wants to take that information and make a lot of observations and conclusions about it. Number one, these are not precise measurements. But even if they were precise measurements, even if you believe them without discussing anything about them, the next slide, this is one more thing about his measurements. He talked to you about the neocortex to cerebellar ratio. Neocortex is the higher level, cerebellar is the part of the brain in the back. But notice the area of the brain that he took and got this counts from, this statistics. Look at this circle. It's out here, it's in the color here, it's around this. This is very crude stuff, folks. This is not precise information. Next slide. Oh, I want to go back one.
Can we go back to this one?
Right here. No, forward, okay.
All right, I'm back.
Right here.
Okay.
I just want you to appreciate, do you remember the bell-shaped curve from when you were in school? You know, we have a bell-shaped curve, and in the middle are most people, and you come out here, and all of this is also normal till you get way, way out at the end, 3+ standard deviations from the normal. He's making a whole big thing, folks, about a standard deviation of 1.79. Pretty close to normal. Let me go to the next slide.
All right.
But let's say you even were to believe his numbers. He's telling you that textbooks and articles show that the scan is used in traumatic brain injury. People are doing research because we'd like to be able to diagnose things early, but right now we can't. So he's got a slide from two of my good friends, and Ron Van Hertem and Ron Tukovsky. This is their 3rd edition. I happen to have the 4th edition here. And the point I want to make is in all of the testimony that I was shown last night when I got this PowerPoint are inferences that research-type papers where people are making postulations and ideas for future research is established clinical use. It's not. And so you can read in these areas where it talks about this could be done, it might be done, and I have this here. Next slide. This was to remind me to show the book. Next slide.
You were reminded.
I was reminded. Here's another thing in which he says, visual analysis may not be sufficient to uncover. I mean, that's why we're doing research, folks. We'd like to figure it out. We'd like to do scans to tell you whether you got a lung cancer after you've been smoking cigarettes for 6 months as a teenager. We don't have that information. Well, we'd like to. And then he says SPM has been used to address these issues. Again, you can read here, and what does he mean? 2 papers, one by Kato, one by Nakashima, used SPM, which is statistical parametric mapping, and 3D SSP respectively. 1 paper. 1 research paper. Not a clinically accepted tool, but it's the job of textbooks.
I'm going to take my phone away.
I'm sorry.
Nothing.
Oh.
My phone rang.
Oh,
Take my phone
I'm
away.
sorry. Just as long as you don't fall asleep during my
I won't,
Okay.
I promise.
Now, but the point being, it's the job of these books to say, hey, here's what's in the horizon. Here's what's going on. Okay, next slide.
I'll just pose a question to you.
Sure.
Oh, is this another reminder slide?
Yes.
Does this slide help you in explaining
No.
your thoughts on this?
No. The thought is this. So PET scans are great techniques, research tools, not done. You come to me, I want to be clear about this. The doctor calls me, a neurologist, and says, Larry, I want you to do a study on my patient because I think he may be have this personality problem. I'm going to say, what? I can't do it. What will I show? Even if I show something, I won't know what it is. You just don't have any criteria at all. So that's why it's not done. Okay. The next thing he talks about is this diffusion tensor imaging, which is a type of MR imaging. And what it is, this is my slide out of the
Can I just
list.
ask real quick, is that magnetic resonating? Is that
Yes,
right? Okay.
MRI, magnetic resonance. This is just out of the, this is what a standard MR would look like, and all of these areas with the gyri and sulci is the gray matter, and inside, is the white matter. And this diffusion tensor imaging is a way to look at white matter. Okay? Now, next slide. In the PowerPoint I was given, which I guess he showed this today, he shows articles to try to say, and I'm sure to make his point, that he thinks these are clinical uses. So here's the slide he showed. So, last night, next slide, because of everything's digital now, I did not have to go to the library and knock on their door at 9 at night. I could go online to the University of Florida libraries and get these original articles. And when you look at the original article, what do they say? That the gold standard for identification of axonal pathology is histochemistry. What does that mean? It means somebody dies and you look at the tissue under the microscope. Diagnostic confirmation only possible post-mortem. Now, neuroimaging techniques may be useful, promising technique. However, considerable work remains before diffusion tensor imaging can be included as part of any clinical diagnosis. Next slide. And again, yes, this textbook has a whole chapter on diffusion tensor imaging in brain injury. 4/5 of the chapter are telling you all about the problems in using diffusion tensor imaging to evaluate white matter. Every company is different. These are really secondary images. I'm not going to bore you with that. I want to point out it's not a clinically accepted technique.
So none of these medical journals or articles are supportive of the proposition that PET scans or MRI can be utilized clinically to diagnose.
Right.
Make sure I say it right. Diagnose personality problems or non-specific brain injury.
Exactly. They're doing, again, lots of research,
Right.
but, yes, next slide. I'm almost finished. And these are just some of the diffusion tensor images. You can see that they don't look like the standard MR with the pretty sulci and gyri. The reason is, by the way, these are secondary images. In other words, the MR is looking at some characteristics of water, and each company has their own program to try to translate the movement of water into a reconstruction of supposed anatomy.
When you say each company, you mean each manufacturer?
Each manufacturer.
Of the MRI.
Right, Siemens, GE, Toshiba. Yeah. Okay, next slide. again, another article which he showed in his thing. It's a review article. He's telling you there have been hundreds of articles. True. Next slide. And again, this is the original, and the idea is a lot of these are in animal models. Their uses are limited, because of all of this, they are limited interpretation of the literature even. And they're limiting references to long-term predictive value, and they say larger longitudinal studies, meaning following people over time, standardized imaging approaches, the promise. So we're doing lots of research, spending a lot of money, not used yet in clinical use, not to evaluate patients, to make a diagnosis and to act on the diagnosis.
Doctor, how many years have you been working with PET scans and MRIs?
Forever. I was lucky enough at Washington University, they developed the first PET scanners. And, but clinically, probably 22, 24 years, but every year they get better and better. More and more uses, more and more tracers. So some things that you did 20 years ago are very different than today.
The tracer is the type of chemical that's being put into the body. With
Yes, because they all do different things.
All right. So
Okay.
let me just cover this real quick. A commonly known use of PET scans is looking for cancer or tumors.
Yeah.
I believe, you correct me if I'm wrong, they put in the glucose, they put some kind of chemical in the glucose so it's metabolized, and the cancer is going to have a higher metabolic rate, it's going to glow or it's going to react in some way so you can see it in areas.
Close enough. We don't like to use the phrase glow, I mean, but it's similar.
That's what people
I mean,
have
it's
told
the
me.
general idea. General idea.
All right.
Okay. So then the third thing that he does is something called brain quantitative volumetrics. It's a great idea. There's a company that has a program that tries to figure out the sizes of different pieces of the brain. And they want to create a database and compare a particular patient to normal. Kind of a neat technique, used in some research. The research mostly is where you follow the same patient over a period of time. You do a scan, you give some drugs, you keep following it. There are lots of problems with this, particularly in creating the normal database. Think about this. What is a normal database? But if you take everybody in this room and you want to create a, quote, normal brain, what do you have to do? Well, you have a template, meaning, well, this is what a general picture, schematic of the brain looks, but you got to take the judge's brain, which is big brain, and my brain, which is a small brain, and you got to make mine bigger, and you got to make hers smaller to fit into this template. And there are lots of templates out there, and there are lots of databases because people are doing lots of research, okay? In fact, well, so anyway, so he is using this technique, and I looked up these references too. Let's just go to the next slide.
Okay.
And he gives you the printout that comes from this company. Okay, and they took some images, they put it into a program, they give you numbers, and again, you can look and see he highlights 2.53 standard deviations, all this. One of them's 3 little areas. Next slide. And again, he's showing you some research articles, you saw this already, in which he's implying that these techniques are used clinically. Next slide. Again, last night, research article. This was left off of his slide. Research article. They used 22 patients. They called it moderate to severe traumatic brain injury. One of the things that happens, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about, I think. One of the things that happens is when you're doing a research project or trying a drug or trying to develop things, you have to have as homogeneous a population as you can get so that you can get rid of extraneous factors. You know, if you call me normal and you're going to put me in a normal database, you got to make sure that I don't have some underlying problem. You also have to say, gee, is this going to be a database of people over 50 or under 20 or whatever? So, but the point is this particular research people used moderate to severe injury. Now, how did they define that? Well, they used the Mayo scale, and it was things like length of post-traumatic amnesia, loss of consciousness, coma scale, sophisticated MR and CT images assessed by a clinical neuroradiologist. And in fact, many of these patients had anatomic lesions seen on the CT and on the MR. Well, Dr. Wu is implying that even small research projects, 22 patients is nothing, small research project papers can be used in a clinical patient. Well, the research papers are somebody who's got major brain abnormalities seen on CT and MR. Next slide. Oh, did Dr. Wu show this slide? Okay, if he did, I'll comment on it.
Yeah, he did.
This is a great paper, okay? This guy really was supposedly normal, working on the railroad, gets this big spike through his head, and his personality changes, okay?
Phineas Gage.
Okay. I'm going to tell you that I would make the observation that this part of his brain probably is related to some of his personality, right? But guess what? This is a big lesion, right? This is this much of the head. What I want you to think about is this. I want to use an analogy. Excuse me. Is there a tissue?
Yes,
No.
sir.
Perfect.
Somewhere.
I've got some here.
Oh, perfect.
Here you go.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much.
Put my
Okay.
big brain to use.
Right. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to use this analogy. You've got a 6-lane highway. I drove in today, and there are a lot of highways here. 6-lane highway. If there's an earthquake and that highway breaks down and falls into the, you're going to have to probably take a detour, and you probably may still get to where you want to go. But that's a lot different than if on that superhighway with 6 lanes, some truck drops a crate of eggs in one lane. You may not even notice it, but what are you going to do? You just detour to the next lane. So the point being, you got to be very careful about trying to say one little black dot on a PET scan using a questionable program is the same as somebody who's got their whole head cut off. Okay? Very careful. The next slide is this study. These people, when you go to the literature and look at the article itself, they all had big-time anatomic changes. Okay? X-ray changes, bullets through the whole head. These people had big-time problems. Next slide. This is the last slide because...
And I'm going to object to the narrative.
Ask the question.
Sure. Does this slide help you in explaining your thoughts on this case?
Dr. Wu thought, from what I read in his thing, if I'm wrong, that the patient had a likelihood of CTE.
Correct.
There is no way to diagnose CTE as we know it from the Boston study outside of autopsy. Okay? We're all doing research to try to see if there's anything. I mean, there's a lot of money being spent. it's just, you can't do it.
Would it be fair to say the slide, you don't have it in your PowerPoint, but the slide he includes, which is a transection of a brain, it looks like it is a transection of a brain at autopsy that shows the brown staining, I can't remember the term for it, but,
Yeah.
you know, it's stuff.
Well, I mean, that's what they're trying to do. I mean, you know, the first step is to make an observation. Then you have to explain it. And the point that I'm making in all of this answer or rebuttal is that even if, and when we will, because I believe we will, be able to find small anatomic things, small differences in glucose accumulation, once we find those, and you believe they're true, what do they mean? And how does the brain work? We don't know that. It's just like the bridge problem. If there's something going on here, what other parts of the brain interact with it? What happens next? You know, somebody has a stroke and they learn to write with their other hand. The brain is very adaptable. So there's no way you can go from any of these potential things directly to behavioral problems.
So it's just not a clinical tool.
So that's my rebuttal that you
Okay.
asked me to rebut.
Good enough. If I understand right, I wanted to go back just briefly. The Vietnam head injury study, so I can understand what you're trying to explain here, is that the people who were involved in this study all had traumatic brain injury.
Oh, big time.
Bullets, shrapnel, things like that.
Yes.
All right. And then I believe it's the study where they were using the Glasgow Coma Scale, yeah, and the post-traumatic amnesia. Again, this is a small,
Objection, leading.
is this a small number of people in this study?
All I'm pointing out here is this is a small research study in which people are they make an observation and they say, is it possible that there's some relationship, and let's see, and then you go from there. But there's lots of work to be done. I mean, this is all research projects. These are not large clinical trials so that you end up in imaging with an appearance on an image, whatever kind of image, and you say, oh, this has this, check, 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 check. Oh, there's a high probability this is lung cancer. In fact, there'll be 89% of people that have this finding will have lung cancer. We're not anywhere near that in the brain.
We have one moment.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you just briefly, you said you didn't want to go there, but let's just talk about it briefly. Dr. Wu's program that he prepared 30 years ago, and you indicated this is not something that's generally available to the public to buy, is that right?
That's correct.
All right. And he has some type of a normative database, or at least he claims it's a normative database. Have you been involved in other cases involving Dr. Wu?
Yes.
All right. Have you ever attempted to obtain that database from him?
I know that some people have asked primarily about the demographics associated with the database.
And when you say demographics, what are you talking about?
Well, at one point, I believe,
Objection, speculation.
Overruled, go ahead.
Dr. Wu said at one point he had 20 patients in the database, okay? And what you mean by demographics, were these all women, all men, all black, all white, over 60, under 60? In other words, information about the database to compare. And my point about not really caring a lot about that at this moment is even if it was perfect, whatever information you were to get from doing these studies, there's no movement towards having value in analyzing and diagnosing anything in an individual patient.
Okay, cross-examination?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Hello?
You indicated that you're associated with the University of Florida, correct?
Yes.
And would you agree with the University of Florida health definition of PET scan that it is a type of imaging test. It uses a radioactive substance called a tracer to look for a disease in the body, correct?
That's correct. I want to interrupt and make one comment. I practice at the University of Florida. I have an academic appointment, but I'm speaking now as an individual.
I understand.
Oh, okay,
You agree
okay.
with that definition.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's a general type of definition. It's fine.
And would you agree that a PET scan shows how organs and tissues are working?
I think that that's probably an oversimplification. So, again, I don't know where that definition is and where it's coming from and who it's directed to, but as I indicated before, depending on the tracer used in the PET scan. So, for instance, we have tracers that try to look at amyloid plaques in diseases. So the tracer is going and becoming associated with an amyloid plaque. That's not saying how the brain is working.
If that definition is correct and it says how it's working, would you agree that basically working and functioning is a matter of semantics?
No.
Would you agree that a PET scan can sometimes detect disease before it shows up on other imaging tests?
Again, I don't want to be academic here. There is most of the time, and I'll use cancer as an example, you see something on an anatomic image, and the characteristics of that anatomy is nonspecific. When you add a PET scan with FDG, you're showing that that area on the scan is taking up and using more or less glucose, more or less energy. And if it's using more energy, you can try to make inferences as to why it's using more energy, and that's what we do.
Can you say, sir, and I believe you may have already answered this, but can you say whether or not Granville Ritchie has brain damage or brain abnormalities?
No.
You cannot say that.
No, I can't say whether you have brain abnormalities.
And you pointed out, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Okay.
You pointed out that you pointed out where you disagreed with Dr. Wu, correct?
Yes.
Now, you would agree that Dr. Wu, like yourself, is a licensed doctor, correct?
I think he's licensed. I don't know.
Are you aware that both of you, obviously yourself, but he has also been acknowledged as an expert in his field of neuropsychiatry?
I don't know that.
Well, you heard, did you listen to his testimony today?
No.
Okay. Have you ever seen his testimony?
I think I have seen his testimony once. Yes, sir.
Has he testified as an expert in the field of neuropsychiatry?
I think so.
Okay. Are you a neuropsychiatrist?
No.
Okay. Now you are, would it be fair to say that you are regularly retained by the state attorney's office to refute defense expert testimony?
I have been asked to do that, I don't know, 10 or 15 times, and whenever I'm asked, I have done it.
And your testimony are your opinions within bounds of reasonable medical certainty? Would that be an accurate assessment?
I think I've demonstrated that, yes.
Now, just as you pointed out that there's constant research going on, correct?
Yes.
You would agree that your opinion is not an absolute in the sense that it's not like a mathematical formula such as 2 + 2 = 4, because that's why there's all this research taking place, correct?
I must tell you that when these cases come up, I don't normally just depend on what I know. I take a few minutes and do another review of the literature. We have the ability to use PubMed. A lot of people use Dr. Google. But we review the literature to see if something new has come up. And as far as I've been able to determine, and I guess this is an opinion, there are no new large clinical trials. There are no appropriateness criteria promulgated by national societies that relate to the use of these images for clinical diagnosis in individual patients. To the extent that you're saying, is that an opinion? I'd like to say it's an informed opinion, but I guess it's an opinion. And I don't know the legal definition of opinion.
And that was my question. I understand that you didn't come in here in a vacuum, but nevertheless, it is an opinion, correct?
I guess so, if that's what it is.
Now, would you agree that it requires a prescription to have a PET scan or an MRI of the brain done?
What do you mean by a prescription?
Well, would it be fair to say that I can't go to the hospital now and I want a PET scan of my brain done, correct?
I don't think so, but for instance, when people do research projects and they recruit candidates, nobody's writing a prescription. They're saying, Mr. Lawyer, would you participate in a research project? We're going to do a brain scan.
Assuming that it's not a research project, assuming that someone is requesting a PET scan of the brain or an MRI, there would have to be some process to get to the point where it can be done, correct?
You're correct in that a physician can request anything. That's one of the issues with medicine and today, is he can request anything. Now, if he requests it and Medicare might not pay for it because they don't think it's efficacious, Aetna or Blue Cross may not pay for it, but a doctor can request anything.
Well, are you aware that in this case, the defendant was interviewed extensively by a psychologist, a neuropsychologist, that he recommended a PET scan and MRI, but in order to get it done for the test results to be ultimately sent to Dr. Wu, the defendant had to be seen by a neurologist, and that had to result in a prescription.
Number one, I do not know anything about who evaluated Mr. Ritchie. I was asked to review images. I'm not a neuropsychologist, so I don't know who interviewed him or what they found. I was asked to say, what do the images show and how can images be used? So I don't know anything about that.
Thank you.
Okay, redirect.
Doctor, you were asked about Dr. Wu's medical expertise. So let me ask you a little bit about that. Dr. Wu holds himself out as a neuropsychiatrist. Is that your understanding?
I think he's a neuropsychiatrist.
Okay. But he does not hold himself out as a radiologist, right?
As far as I know, he's not a radiologist and he's not a nuclear physician.
Not a nuclear physician. Certainly not board certified in either one of those areas.
That's correct.
All right. So a neuropsychiatrist using images, electronic images, such as PET and MRI, is it your understanding he arrived to that through some type of other avenue, an academic avenue, like an apprenticeship or something like that?
You know, I really don't know all the details about his training and what he does. I do think that...
Objection, speculation.
Don't guess, but go ahead.
He has said in the past that he went to California to work in the laboratory of a guy who had a PET scanner, which was given to them by a charity or something, and he did essentially and he said this, essentially an apprenticeship using that PET scanner in California, and I don't know the exact dates.
Okay. But as far as you know, it wasn't a fellowship, is that right?
That's correct.
He's not board certified in radiology or nuclear medicine.
That's correct.
All right. You mentioned doing reviews in every case that you're retained on, and you indicated you do a review of the literature to make sure that there aren't any new large-scale studies that have been done that you're not aware of.
That's correct.
And you indicated PubMed. What is PubMed for those of us that don't know?
Well, the National Library of Medicine has almost every journal, every article ever written, cataloged 6 Ways to Sunday, and you can search that and get the articles and look at them and read them. That's considered the definitive source for medical literature.
All right. And in your experience, you have testified numerous times in rebuttal to Dr. Blue, is that correct?
That's correct.
In those cases, was he retained by the defense?
Oh, yes.
Have you ever known of him to be retained by the prosecution or the state or the federal government?
Well, I don't know, but I don't know his whole history.
Speculation.
If you know, you can answer.
Well, I don't know.
All right. Well, in any case you've worked on, was he testifying for the state?
No.
You have nothing else, Your Honor?
Okay, may this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you, doctor. You're free to go.
Thank you very much.
All right, state our next witness.
State calls Dr. Emily Lazarou.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give in this cause is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Hey, just step up here and have a seat in the witness stand.
Okay, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon.
Good
I'll let you
afternoon.
get situated. I'll let you get situated.
Yeah, I'm pretty short, so my arms aren't that far.
All right. And could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
My name is Emily Lazarou, MD.
All right. That's medical doctor?
Yes.
All right. What do you do for a living?
I'm a general and forensic psychiatrist.
And do you own your own business?
Yes.
Can you tell us what you do there?
I do medication management and psychotherapy, and I also do forensic work.
Can you tell us your educational background?
I have my undergrad degree from Baylor University in Waco, Texas, and then I went on to get my master's degree at Texas A&M in human nutrition and dietetics. Then I went on to medical school at the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio. And then I came here to Florida to do my residency in psychiatry at the University of South Florida Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Medicine. In the final year of my residency, I was the chief resident over all the psychiatrists. And then I was the first resident in the USF Psychiatry Forensic Psychiatry program.
Can you tell us your work history in the area of forensic psychiatry?
My clinical experience in forensics started actually in the prison. I worked in Union Correctional Facility, which is a psychiatric prison. I've worked on death row. I've worked at Florida State Prison. I've worked at multiple different jails in Citrus County, Polk County, here at the Falkenberg Road Jail. And I've also done work as the chief psychiatrist at the North Texas Psychiatric Hospital, which is a forensic hospital. And I've also run a not guilty by reason of insanity clinic where I was the chief psychiatrist over that clinic as well.
All right. And that last clinic you ran, what was that concerning? What kind of work did you do for them?
I was a clinical psychiatrist that treated patients that have been released, not guilty by reason of insanity, into the community, and I was in charge of maintaining them, so that way they were safe in the community. I also restored competency in people that were awaiting trial for different offenses.
When you worked at Union Correctional and the other correctional institutions and the jails here in Florida, what type of work were you doing in that setting?
I'm a clinical psychiatrist in those settings.
So you treat individuals?
Oh yeah, I treat patients. Yep.
Now, do you currently maintain a clinical practice?
Yes, that's what I do primarily.
And do you also do consultation work like you're doing in this case?
Oh yes.
Were you retained by the state of Florida to work on this case?
Yes, I was.
Are you board certified in any areas of medicine?
Yes, I'm board certified in general and forensic psychiatry.
Have you previously testified as an expert in the area of forensic psychiatry?
Yes.
Your Honor, I would tender Dr. Lazarou as an expert in the area of forensic psychiatry.
I don't have any questions this time here.
Okay.
Did you receive materials in this case when you were retained?
Yes.
Have you continued to receive materials over the last several months?
Yes, I just received 3,000 pages of documents yesterday.
Okay. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. In cases involving the death penalty, and you've been hired to act as a rebuttal witness in this case, correct?
Yes.
In cases involving the death penalty, do you have access to both the defendant as far as examining him? Well, let's talk about that first. Do you have access to the defendant to examine him before he's convicted of capital murder?
No.
Did you examine him yesterday?
Yes, last night.
And how long did that examination go on for?
From approximately 4:30 p.m. to about 8 p.m.
So from the time we broke here in court into the night?
Yes.
All right. So you have not had an opportunity to go out on multiple occasions like Dr. Eisenstein did?
Correct. I have not. I don't have the opportunity, no.
All right. And so you conducted your clinical evaluation of the defendant yesterday?
Yes.
And you indicated you were just received within the last couple of days several thousand pages of documents and records?
Yesterday morning at 8 a.m. when I got here, I got 3,000 pages of documents.
And those are records that were given to us by the defense, is that correct?
Yes.
What did they include?
That was primarily jail medical records, as well as employment records, educational record.
All right, so the jail records, would those be records from the defendant's incarceration from August of 2014 until now?
Yes.
Or till some recent time?
Correct. It last dated in 2019, yeah.
Would those include any treatment by medical staff at the Hillsborough County Jail?
Yes, it's treatment and behavioral records.
And do they also include medication records?
Yes.
Distribution of medications?
Yes.
Prescription of medications?
Correct, as well as refusals of medications.
Refusals, does it also include requests for medication?
Yes.
Have you received, in this case, when you were retained from the state of Florida, did you receive the law enforcement reports in this case?
Yes, when I originally was retained, I got a packet of information which include the law enforcement records, the police records of the investigation, as well as the autopsy pictures. That information was what I received.
All right. Did you receive any audio or video recordings?
Yes, I received, actually yesterday, one jail phone call, and prior to that I also received the interview with police with the defendant.
And did you receive interviews with other witnesses?
Yes, I received not the audio of those, but the actual transcribed
All right. Would
interviews.
that include interviews with Calissa Kelly?
Yes.
And Ivy Van?
Yes.
The interviews as contained and paraphrased, I believe maybe the transcripts of Gloria Gibson's interviews with law enforcement on the 17th of May
Correct.
of 2014?
Yes.
All right. Did you also, through the police reports, see the interviews with other witnesses in the case, such as the victim's mother and other witnesses?
Yes, and the godmother, as well as I also received depositions in the case as well.
Okay. And I forgot about the godmother. You're talking about Ebony Wiley.
Yes.
All right. You received her interviews.
Oh, yes.
Your evaluation of the defendant yesterday, can you tell us what that included, what exactly you did during that evaluation?
It's a typical forensic psychiatric evaluation. So what I did was first do an informed consent that what we talked about was going to potentially be talked about to you guys today. And then I go through just a clinical examination, trying to understand. Now I have also the data that I've received as well. So I have all that data as well as Dr. Eisenstein's evaluation to to sort of tell me areas that have been areas of concern. But I do go through a general forensic evaluation, which includes how he's doing now as well as in the past, looking at family psychiatric history, his own psychiatric history, social history, which includes relationships, employment, education, trauma history. That's the bulk of the material. And then, again, using what I knew had been areas of concern, I focus on certain areas of concern based upon what other people have noted.
You mentioned Dr. Eisenstein. Did you just recently receive his report?
Yes, again, with all that material that I received, I believe the night before I received the 3,000 pages, so approximately 9 or 10 p.m. the night before I received that evaluation.
All right. And you have his report. Did you receive his raw data?
No, I requested that, but I was not provided that.
So the neuropsychological testing that he conducted produces raw data.
Yes.
And what kind of raw data is produced in those tests?
Well, depending upon the different tests, the tests that, as a psychiatrist, I don't do all the tests that psychologists do, but there are certain tests that I do and I am able to review as a psychiatrist trained in forensics. And many of those tests, which include the SIMS, the MMPI, which is the personality assessment, those different materials have specific things that I would be looking for. But again, I was not given that.
You're not given the raw data that was produced from that testing?
No.
Based on everything that you've reviewed in this case, well, let me ask you this too, because I left out one thing. Did you, within the last 24 hours, after going through all of this material that was provided to you yesterday, these thousands of pages, did you make a decision to contact a business here in the United States?
Oh, yes. After I spoke with the defendant last night, I asked him about his education and training, and he had mentioned that he was certified by a company called Comtrain, which is a provider to certify people to do the cell phone tower work that he had been doing. I called them this morning.
Okay. And what did you communicate with them about?
I asked the service person, Christy, about their training, about the certification process. She told me that it was an extensive process, which includes 8 hours of in-class training. And then you have to pass an examination, a written examination, to be able to move on to do the physical aspect of that job, the physical training, which, again, is another 8 hours. I asked her about the intellectual capacity, which if someone with an impaired cognitive function, could they do that? And she said it was not possible for somebody with an impaired intellect to be able to go through that training and pass the training, as the defendant told me he did.
And what drugs are prescription drugs is the defendant currently prescribed, and what is he taking currently?
He's prescribed Zoloft, which is an antidepressant medication. That's one medication. He's also on a medication called Vistaril, which is a medication typically, or at least in his case, for sleep, which is a sort of a sedative type of drug. And then he also was recently put on a medication called Abilify, which is an atypical antipsychotic medication.
And why was he put on Abilify? What's it being utilized for?
The Abilify is being used...
Abilify, I'm sorry, I mispronounced it.
As many of you guys may have seen in commercials, it's being used for a depression augmentation strategy. So he has been diagnosed with nonspecific depression, and they've been treating him with Zoloft since August of 2014. And he is on the highest FDA-approved dose of that medication, which is 200 milligrams. And so when he went to the nurse practitioner, he had requested more medication. So that augmentation strategy that they used was to add Abilify to the drug regimen.
Is that common in the jail for a defendant, an inmate, to be able to request medication like that?
Unfortunately, yes.
And receive it?
Yes.
So they're basically self-diagnosing?
Well, some people can be convincing.
All right. Do you, in your opinion, feel that he suffers from a form of depression?
I have given him a diagnosis of adjustment disorder with depressed mood chronic due to the legal situation, because his depression didn't start until he found out he was being charged with this crime.
Right. And is that something in your experience working in the prisons and the jails, is that common
Yes, it's very common.
for inmates?
Yes.
And is that because of the incarcerative setting they're in?
Well, it's because of that as well as what they anticipate it will be.
Okay. Have you worked on death penalty cases before?
Yes.
Where the state is seeking the death penalty?
Yes.
And is that a common diagnosis of defendants who are potentially facing a death sentence?
An adjustment disorder with depressed mood?
Yes.
I don't know if that's a common diagnosis. There's one diagnosis that's more common that I notice.
Okay. Did you also, and I left this out, did you receive you've been in here, right, for most of the last day or two?
Yes.
In the courtroom? All right. And as your status as an expert witness, a rebuttal to mental health mitigation, you're allowed to sit in and watch proceedings in penalty phase?
Yes.
Did you, previously, were you provided with the mitigation video that we all watched today?
Yes, I received that last week.
I was asking you earlier, have you come to an opinion in this case as to a diagnosis of the defendant?
Yes.
And to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, what would be your diagnosis of the defendant?
The primary diagnosis is antisocial personality disorder. But as you guys already know, I also gave a diagnosis of adjustment disorder with depressed mood. And another diagnosis is cannabis use disorder in partial remission in a controlled environment.
All right, let's start with that, the cannabis abuse and partial remission. Why are you diagnosing that as being partial remission?
Because that is what the jail had diagnosed, and it is very rare for them to do that. So based upon what his history is, and that diagnosis that the jail has provided, that's why I gave that diagnosis.
Right. And what does that mean, partial remission?
Partial remission means that somebody is still using.
Right. And how is he using if he's in confinement in the jail in a solitary setting?
Are you asking me just to speculate about that?
I don't want you to speculate, but is there any other way he'd be able to utilize marijuana within the jail other than accessing it through either an employee of the jail or another inmate?
My opinion is that he's accessing it through an employee of the jail because visitation is via phone, telecommunication, so it's not in person in the jail. So it has to be a staff member.
In your experience working in the Department of Corrections and jails, is that uncommon?
It is not uncommon, unfortunately.
For contraband to find its way into the jails or prisons through the employees?
That is not uncommon.
For some type of financial reimbursement?
Or relationship.
Are there female employees at the Hillsborough County Jail?
Yes.
Let's work our way back up. I think you've already explained the depressive or depression diagnosis.
Yes.
Are these diagnoses ones that you're making through diagnostic criteria from the Diagnostic Standard Manual, the DSM-5?
Yes, a diagnostic and statistical manual.
Statistical manual.
Yeah.
Statistical manual. And is that a diagnostic measure or device that is used by psychiatrists, forensic psychiatrists?
It's a guide, and it's used by mental health professionals, so that way our communication is the same among other people. So when I say antisocial personality disorder, somebody else knows what that means.
Okay, so it is objectively categorized and defined within the DSM-5?
Yeah, what it is basically it describes what the illness is, and it actually gives criteria, and somebody has to meet a certain number of the criteria in order to make that diagnosis.
And you're familiar with those criteria?
Yes.
Are you familiar with that disorder?
Yes, very familiar with
And
it.
have you dealt with that over the course of your career dealing with the forensic setting?
Yes.
Have you previously diagnosed it?
Oh, yes.
So in this case, before we get into the actual definition, can you just tell, well, maybe you should just go ahead and define the disorder for us first, and then we can talk about what diagnostic criteria the defendant has.
Well, how I like to define it is that personality disorders in general, I tell patients, it's the lens through which we view the world. So that is everything about the world, and how we interact with the world is what our personality style is. And so that's what this personality disorder is. Antisocial personality disorder is a specific personality disorder within what we call cluster B, which is a more dramatic personality style. And there are other personality disorders in that as well. Narcissistic, borderline, histrionic, and then antisocial personality disorder. how I describe antisocial personality disorder is a criminal personality type, and that is then defined by the criteria. So there are 7 criteria in antisocial personality disorder. Someone, to get the diagnosis, only needs to meet 3 of those criteria.
What are the 7 criteria?
The first one is the failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors as indicated by repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest.
Okay, and what is the next criteria?
Deceitfulness, as indicated by repeated lying, use of aliases, or conning others for personal profit or pleasure.
And what's the next one?
Impulsivity or failure to plan ahead.
And the next one?
Irritability and aggressiveness, as indicated by repeated physical fights or assaults.
And what is the next criteria?
Reckless disregard for the safety of self or others.
All right. And go ahead and if you just read the rest of them for us.
Consistent irresponsibility, as indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor financial obligations. And the final criteria is lack of remorse, as indicated by being indifferent or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another.
And how many of those criteria did you find that the defendant met?
5.
And which 5?
The failure to conform to social norms, the deceitfulness, conning, use of alias, impulsivity, consistent irresponsibility to honor financial obligations, and lack of remorse.
And were you basing that solely on your interview and your evaluation of the defendant yesterday?
No.
Did the record history from this case, law enforcement reports and interviews, especially his interview with the police and interviews with other individuals who related to the police, his behavior towards them, did that play a part in your opinion?
Oh, yes. All of that plays a part. Every different aspect from, again, my clinical interview, but also, he's also been seen by psychologists. He's also been, there's the video of him interacting with police officers. And then, again, all of the interviews with different people that have interacted with him regarding this crime and all of the different manipulations that have occurred between him and other people in relation to this crime.
Can you tell us what you're talking about specifically as far as manipulations and his how he treated people, including the victim in this case? That played a part in your opinion?
It all plays a part in my opinion, yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm asking, can you just tell us with more specificity what it was in the law enforcement reports, interviews, statements that you looked at or gave weight to?
Well, I gave weight to everything, and I guess the primary or the initial thing that I reviewed was the police reports and the extensiveness and the quickness on which this murder occurred, and then how much how much detail it required to counteract every potential possibility of being caught. Talking to every single person surrounding him, his mother, his girlfriends, the person involved in, Felicia's godmother, all of those people, and communicating with them to all have the same story to then present to the police officers, who then were in charge of trying to find this person, and bypassing and taking a lot of time away from the police officers' effort to find this person. It was an extensive amount of material done in very quick succession.
Did you take into account his interview and the multiple lies that he told to the detectives in his interview?
Yes, and even when presented with other situations, the quickness on which he could respond to counteract whatever they were saying, even though what they were saying was true.
Was there a difference in his behavior on the video with the detectives that you noted versus his behavior that you've seen here in court and also when you were doing your evaluation and interview yesterday?
Yes, it's a dramatic difference between that and what I saw.
Can you tell us what it is you're noting as a difference?
Oh, the speed. I mean, in that interview with the police, he's very animated and he's moving around and talking, and in my interview was just like this, sort of like what you're seeing now, but just in a verbal way, and then asking, when is this going to be over, kind of thing.
During your interview?
Yes.
Evaluation? Did you, in the records you did receive from the defense, the 3,000 pages or so of records yesterday, did you receive any extensive medical history prior to his incarceration in the Hillsborough County Jail?
No, there is not extensive medical history. I literally received one piece of paper that was the report of a CT scan that was done when he was assessed in the ER for heat exhaustion.
CT scan, and what was the results of that scan?
It was normal.
And that was a CT scan of his head, his brain?
Yeah, CT brain without contrast.
Any indication in that medical record that he suffered any kind of brain injury or head injury?
No, and I wanted to make a comment about that because when we see somebody in the ER for heat exhaustion, a CT scan of the head is an automatic within the evaluation for somebody with heat exhaustion, because when somebody gets evaluated for heat exhaustion, a lot of times they are doing some physical activity where they could fall and then be hurt. And the symptoms of falling from heat exhaustion and heat exhaustion are very similar, the dizziness, headache, and that type of thing. So we want to make sure to rule out a possibility of a severe thing like a brain bleed before you then say totally that it's heat exhaustion. So it is a standard protocol when somebody comes in the ER with heat exhaustion.
In any of the records that you got that were medical records or any records that describe a medical history, did you see any diagnosis by any medical professionals of either PTSD or ADD or ADHD?
No.
Do you believe he suffers from any of those things?
No.
Did he indicate anything to you that indicates that he may have, or did you see any reliable evidence that he ever did?
No, I actually went through that extensively with the defendant last night because I know that was a question, and I really didn't know where the question came from, actually. But when I asked him, PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder is an anxiety disorder. Actually, one of the worst anxiety disorders that there are. And the basis of that is trauma. And when you ask someone about symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, the very first symptom that you ask about is anxiety or nervousness. And over again, and I asked it many times, the defendant said he was not ever nervous. He was not a nervous guy. It was not his personality. He's not nervous. So somebody with post-traumatic stress disorder is very nervous. And that interview, as you can imagine, it's a very nervous situation because somebody's asking you all these questions and it's somewhat of a life or death situation. And he was not nervous at all. And in the records as well in the jail, there's no anxiety in there. It is primary depression as it relates to the legal situation.
So no anxiety demonstrated or documented in any of the medical records from the jail?
No.
Anything in the records from the jail, from the medical providers, that would indicate he ever suffered a brain injury or a head injury?
No, and that's another thing that's important in the jail records. Readily in the jail, we see inmates all the time that have cognitive problems or intellectual disability. It's very common for us to see that. And it is very much put in the chart right at the beginning because it really guides the way that you treat the inmate, not only in treating them with medications, but also treating them behaviorally with the staff. Even where they're located is also indicative of their cognitive abilities. And there is nowhere in this chart that there's even a question about his cognitive ability or intellectual ability.
None of that's documented?
No.
None of that's even addressed?
No, it's not even an issue.
No suspicions of that?
No suspicions of that.
In your interview with the defendant yesterday, did you note anything in your evaluation to suggest he had any cognitive functioning issues?
Not at all.
Anything in the history of this case involving the investigation, the death of Felicia Williams, any of the interviews with people who interacted with the defendant that leads you to believe he had any kind of cognitive frontal lobe disorder or cognitive issues?
Not at all.
In fact, did your review of this case indicate that he had quite the contrary?
Yes.
And did your review of his educational records that were provided and the educational information you gained from the defendant, coupled with what you heard today from another state witness, did that indicate to you that he has a higher level of functioning, executive functioning?
In terms of his, well, first, when I spoke with the defendant regarding his education, he in fact told me, and as I spoke with him about, going to Kingston College, he told me he had all A's. in the school, the high school he was in before, in order to even get into that college. So he acknowledged that he has to have a certain level of functionality. It did well on the test in order to get there. The issue was, which is why that he didn't do well there, is, and what I see in a lot of patients when they go from high school and do very well to college, is that the volume of work is so much higher. You know, the defendant wanted to go to Kingston College because it was prestigious and because he felt that he could get something out of that if he graduated from there. And then I asked him, well, is there a reason why it's prestigious? Yes, it's harder. It's harder. So he went from making all A's in a regular high school to then going to Kingston College, which is much more challenging, and he was not putting a full effort in. He failed in 9th grade, then he made a concerted effort to do better, and he then did pass. So he acknowledged when he tried, that's when he could do better. So it's not a lack of intellectual ability, it's a lack of responsibility and maturity and taking that responsibility seriously.
Okay. So maturity and effort played, in your opinion, a large role in him failing out in 9th grade.
Certainly, and it's also documented in employment records as well that was an issue.
Maturity and effort.
Yes.
In the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder, you indicated, I believe, and I tried to write them down and I was only getting cryptic amounts of information down, but there was a failure to maintain consistent employment or something
Yes.
like that? All right.
Well, it's responsibility, consistent irresponsibility, as indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor financial obligations.
Did the fact that in the case, the evidence in the case revealed the defendant, while representing to the police and apparently to Ms. Wiley and to Ms. Van, that he had employment, that he worked, that he was paid for things, that he in fact hadn't worked consistently since Christmas and this was May, did that play a part in that criteria being met?
Yes, it did. And the fact that then, not only that he didn't maintain consistent work employment, but then in order to make ends meet, then utilizing or using these women, saying different things to them in order to get things from them in order to support him. That's part of that criteria.
And did the fact that the defendant manipulated, and I believe the term you used, conned Ebony Wiley into getting to Felicia Williams, did that play a part in your diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder?
Certainly, yes. It was one of the very first things because I looked at the police reports first.
Did you review a phone call, and I think you indicated earlier you had received a phone call between the defendant and Calissa Kelly that was made on the eve of trial in this case, where Ms. Kelly was being asked to come down and meet with the prosecution to prepare for trial, to be shown her statement, and be given a fair opportunity to prepare and refresh her memory?
Yes.
And did you take that into consideration in rendering your opinion of antisocial personality disorder?
Of course I did. It just was more supportive of what I had already done.
And what occurred in that phone call that you found significant to your opinion?
I had a couple statements that I highlighted. Am I able to say those statements?
Absolutely.
The first statement was made by the defendant, and he said to her, if they ask you a question, you answer it. If they don't ask you a question, you keep your mouth shut. So telling her what to say or not to say.
And would you consider that to be continued manipulation?
Oh, yes. And another statement that I felt was very significant is, tell them you only want to come to court. You don't go for no preparation. You are not supposed to go nowhere. Don't go nowhere. So again, manipulating her, telling her what to do to make sure that it looks best for him, without regard for her at all.
Now, just to touch on this, we talked about prior medical records. There was a prior, I believe, Dr. Eisenstein talked about 2 instances where he was involved or allegedly involved in a car accident, one being in Texas. Did you have any records of that?
I have I don't even want to call it a record because it looks like it was a typed out, somewhat manufactured report. There is no insurance company name on it. There's no hospital name on it.
It's not a law enforcement report?
It's not a law enforcement report. It's literally just a manufactured report. I don't know where it came from, but it reports or documents 2 different crashes that the defendant, I believe, reported that he was in.
Okay. Now, there was an accident here in Tampa, I believe, where the defendant was taken to Brandon Hospital, where we received, I believe, one. That was the one you were talking about. No, that was a heat exhaustion.
Yeah, there was no record.
No records. Okay. So, as far as we know, this is self-reporting by the defendant.
This is self-report, and I did ask him about those things.
And what did he say? If you recall.
I want to make sure that I say it correctly.
Sure. Take your time.
He does talk about just that car accident you want me to talk about?
Yes.
Okay. The motor vehicle accident in 2012, he said that he was rear-ended and that he was picked up by an ambulance, he said. He was on a stretcher and went to the hospital. I asked him what happened, and he said he was stopped for a school bus, and then somebody slammed into the back of his truck. He was wearing a seatbelt. His mom was a passenger. She didn't have any injuries, but he reported that he had whiplash. He said that an MRI was done, although I know we don't have any documentation of that. And then he says that he thinks he went home the next day. I asked him if there was a lawsuit involved in that case. He said yes. He said the case, he got the money from the lawsuit within a couple of months of the accident, which, just given my training, I've never heard that happen that quickly. And then he said he used the money from that to get a new car.
That was in 2012.
Yes.
Did he say anything about a head injury?
No. I mean, whiplash is a neck injury. And then there was another one in 2009, which he said there was another accident, not hospitalization. He said he hit his face on the steering wheel, but the airbag was deployed. He said that essentially he was driving down the highway, and he said, I think I was speeding, and he said his car spun around, but there was no other cars involved, and his car was totaled. He was taken to the police station, and someone picked him up.
Did you talk to the defendant, and did you see some type of self-reporting by the defendant to Dr. Eisenstein concerning, I believe, one instance where he slipped and fell as a child, and then another instance where I believe he reported a desk fell on his shoulders?
Now, I asked the defendant about every one of these instances specifically because I did not want to miss one thing that had already been talked about or anything else. He never talked about the desk incident, so I don't know if that incident actually happened.
Well, let me ask you about this. Did you see the mitigation video where it was discussed by his brother, Trevor, that a chair fell on him?
I watched the video. I can't remember that specifically.
Okay.
It didn't ring out to me to be something very important. But the other one, when he slipped and fell and hit his head, that was when he was 10 years old. He clarified for me because I asked what type of surface it was. He said it was a concrete surface, and essentially he said that they were playing soccer on what seems like to be a concrete slab, and it was wet. And he said that he slipped and fell on it based upon that.
And are you aware that Dr. Eisenstein reported in his report, and I believe testified, that the defendant did not tell him the type of surface that he fell on?
Correct, but then my interview, as you know, was after that testimony.
Correct. That type of information, self-reporting, do you look at that with a skeptical eye as a mental health professional?
Well, I mean, as a psychiatrist, when I see patients, that's what I take as what's happened. But just given this case and given the amount of inconsistencies in his statements to different people, especially people in authority, such as police officers, then that makes you really question the validity of anything that he says.
After your evaluation yesterday, were you in court this morning before the jury was brought in and before the trial started, or when Dr. Wu had made a request to go into the holding cell and meet with the defendant?
Yes.
And did you see Dr. Wu go in there and meet with the defendant? Go through
Yes.
the door? You didn't go back there with him, obviously.
No, I didn't go back.
And when he came back out, the state was allowed to question him about what occurred?
Yes.
The direction of the court, is that right?
Yes.
And when I was speaking with Dr. Wu, did I ask for you to come up and stand next to me so you could hear what he was saying?
Yes.
And do you recall Dr. Wu talking about asking the defendant about some type of an epilepsy measure or scale of symptoms, and the defendant identifying after having them listed to him that he had deja vu and he had had the sensation of ants underneath his skin?
Correct.
All right. And at that time, did you make some statement to Dr. Wu?
Well, yes.
And what was that?
I can't help myself. I asked him, well, was that just in the context of him just being him, or was that in the context of him using drugs? Because he uses drugs. He uses hallucinogens and other drugs. And he said, oh, that's a good question. Maybe I should go ask him.
Okay. And he went and asked.
Yes.
And then he came back and reported to me what he said.
Yes.
And I believe you may have been privy to that conversation.
Yes.
Is that something that should have been asked initially?
There's a lot of things that should have been asked. Yes.
The drug use, was that part of your diagnosis? I know you gave us the cannabis diagnosis.
Yes, but again, as a part of my evaluation, I asked him about every drug. Not only if he used, but if he sold, based upon what I know in the police reports. And so we went through each different drug, including marijuana, ecstasy, tobacco, alcohol, and any other drugs.
And you knew from the reports that he utilized ecstasy on occasion?
Yes.
Ebony Wiley had testified and had told the police that he gave her ecstasy or Molly
Yes.
sometime before going into the apartment with Felicia.
Correct.
Doctor, you indicated again that in the antisocial personality disorder diagnosis, there is a diagnostic criteria of deception or lying.
Yes.
All right. And did you note, other than the things you've talked about so far, his interactions with the police, with other individuals, the ladies that he was dating, including Ebony Wiley, and false statements, lies, deception he used, did you note anything in the jail records where he's utilizing those types of things with jail staff?
Oh, yes.
Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. In the jail, they log different behaviors. Not only do they log serious behaviors, but they log other types of behaviors. And there was a couple that I noted in the records here. These are all 2018. One note specifically talked about the defendant doing what we call phishing and giving things to other people under their doors. And the officer noted, inmate Ritchie shows a complete disregard for following facility rules. So that is implying that there's more than just this one instance, but that's one instance. And then a little bit further up, there's another entry. Inmate appears to be attempting to manipulate how staff organizes recreation in 1 Bravo, as well as trying to monopolize the television viewing in 1B Mod by trying to dictate the television channels. So again, this is him controlling his environment, not the environment controlling somebody that is intellectually incapable of doing that.
When you said Alpha Charlie, is that one of the designated pods or big group areas within the jail?
Yes.
Is that type of behavior consistent with cognitive deficits, brain damage, anything like that?
No, but it is consistent with antisocial personality disorder.
There was testimony from Dr. Eisenberg under the VRAG. Are you familiar with that, or did you look into that?
I did look into that once he spoke about it. I did in my fellowship. We had talked about it, but, and you may ask me more questions, but because it's not normed in the United States, it wasn't something that we went into in much detail.
Okay. Was this something that was normed in Canada?
Yes. And the population that was looked at in the VRAG is specifically a population, I believe it was over 600 male inmates in a psychiatric prison. So these are inmates that have had violent offenses in a psychiatric part. So significant mental health issues in order to get into that and violent offenses. So they're looking at the assessment, or Dr. Eisenstein looked at that assessment and compared those people to the defendant as if they were the same or as if they were similar. So he's putting the worst of the worst next to this defendant, making him look much better than them. So again, it was a misapplication of this VRAG
Okay. When you
in
say
order
the
to
worst
come
of
up
the
with
worst,
that risk.
You're including worse mental health issues. with
Yes,
that. Okay.
yes.
Antisocial personality disorder, does it include an element of dangerousness or future dangerousness?
Oh, yes.
Can you discuss that with us, please?
I mean, once a person is an antisocial personality disorder, they are more likely to do these types of things. It's because it's part of their makeup. As I said, it's the lens through which we view the world. So that's how they see things. They see people as opportunities to overcome, not as we see, average people see people. So because of that, then there's this sort of victimizer mentality, which again is part of the antisocial personality disorder.
And is part of that the lack of remorse?
Yes.
Would someone with antisocial personality disorder put themselves and their self-interest above others?
Oh, yes. That's part of the disorder. And then they have no remorse for doing so and justify their reasons for doing so.
And that they have no remorse. Whatever criminal acts they occurred would not be something that they would in the future perseverate or think about at length.
No, and as the defendant had described to me those types of acts, they were a mistake. So if you just perceive that as a mistake and not something very serious as if that it is, then you're more likely to continue to make mistakes.
Is there a common term that's associated with antisocial personality disorder? Another way of phrasing it? I've heard it associated to psychopathy or psychopath or sociopath.
Those are two different constructs. A psychopath is a higher level, and is a higher level of antisocial is encompassed within that, but it is not the only thing. People can have antisocial personality disorder without having psychopathy. And if I thought that the defendant had psychopathy, I would say it.
Okay. Now, the MMPI that you talked, I don't know, I believe you talked about that earlier, that Dr. Eisenstein had administered to the defendant.
Yes.
Was there a malingering scale within that?
Yes, and interestingly, it's not in the report. So luckily it was asked about yesterday, and he had mentioned that the score on that was 85.
Okay. And what does that indicate to you?
Anything above 80 is a clear indication of malingering, which is feigning its symptoms.
All right, so fake.
Correct.
And the MMPI is a personality assessment that you are familiar with as a psychiatrist and you utilize and have worked with before.
Oh, yes, and was trained in my fellowship.
So that scale indicates that during this psychological testing that there was indications the defendant was feigning, faking, fudging, however you want to word it.
Yes, Dr. Eisenstein said exaggerating. Yes.
Thank you, Doctor. I'll turn it to the witness.
Cross-examination.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Doctor, as you testified, you did an evaluation of Mr. Ritchie last night, correct?
Yes.
And you basically it was an interview, correct?
Correct.
And it lasted maybe 3 to 4 hours, something of that nature?
Correct.
He was cooperative, was he not?
He was cooperative, but minimally.
He answered all your questions, did he?
He answered the questions yes, on a very basic level. Again, don't say any more than what is asked. Yes.
Well, he gave, at least in some questions, it was certainly much more than a yes or no answer. He gave you some details, correct?
That's right, yes.
And A psychological evaluation, as you've indicated, consists of basically an interview. It's not it's not psychological testing and evaluations like a psychologist does, such as Dr. Eisenstein.
That's correct.
You did no psychological testing, correct?
I had no need to do psychological testing in this case.
So you did not do it?
That's correct.
And your interview of him is based on things that you've read or heard of in the case, correct?
Do in part, but then it also, as I said, is a general evaluation that I do, and then yes, I took into account some things that I knew from the record.
And in the, for instance, in the course of the interview, you asked him, obviously there had been information that you've been provided that he had suffered injuries in the course of his childhood and growing up, correct?
Correct, yes.
And you asked him if he had any scars, correct?
Well, I asked him if he was ever injured to the point where he needed to be hospitalized, and he said he did not, but that he did have scars, and I asked him if I could look at it, and he said yes, and he has a scar, 2 scars on his back.
Okay, he basically showed you without any provocation. You asked him and he showed it to you, correct?
He allowed me to look at him, yeah.
Okay. Now, in reviewing jail records, you indicated, or you noticed that the defendant had gained 50 pounds in the 5 or so years that he's been incarcerated, correct?
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
And you also, as you already indicated, you noticed that he had been prescribed several medications at the jail, correct?
Yes.
And you asked him, did you not, if he had replaced his sexual appetite with eating, since he had gained this weight and none of the medications caused weight gain?
Well, it's called substance substitution, and that's what I talked with him about. And I said that is a possible reason why he gained weight, and not necessarily due to medication.
One of the medications that he is on is Abilify.
Yes.
And is it true that you told him that that does not cause weight gain?
It is a weight-neutral drug, as is Zoloft, yes.
Well, so you're saying that one of the side effects of Abilify is not weight gain?
It is a side effect. It's going to be on every antipsychotic. Weight gain is a potential side effect, yes.
Okay, so it is. In fact, you incorrectly told him that it was not a side effect. Weight gain was not a side effect of the medication.
Well, it was not a side effect of that in the sense that he had already gained all that weight by the time he got put on Abilify.
But you acknowledge that Abilify does cause weight gain.
It's a potential side effect of that drug. But again, he was not on it when he gained all that weight.
Did you tell the defendant that the medication that he is taking, that's been prescribed to him, was a waste of time?
I didn't say it was a waste of time. What I said was, if he has already been on a high dose of Zoloft and he told me he didn't feel that it was effective, continuing on that is a waste of time, and they should consider changing medications, because if he truly wants to get better, you'd maybe want to switch medications rather than just piling on additional medications.
Well, I know that you've indicated that maybe some things are not always done properly at the jail, but the jail does have doctors, correct?
Certainly, yeah.
Medical doctors.
Yes.
And these medications are prescribed by doctors, correct?
Oh, yes, yes.
And in this case, with respect to these medications, they had been prescribed to Mr. Ritchie, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And normally it's done after there's a physical exam of an inmate, of a patient or inmate at the jail, correct?
Right when the inmate comes into jail, they have a physical examination. So that's standard protocol.
You did not perform any kind of physical examination, correct?
Well, I examined his back, didn't I?
Okay. Outside of examining his back.
Correct.
Okay. Now, did you acknowledge that he is currently receiving Abilify, Zoloft, and I believe the third one is Visceral, correct?
Yes.
And these medications are generally given to someone with some type of mental illness, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Is it true that you kept asking him, why are you so slow?
Yes.
Okay. And regarding one of the interviews, or one of the questions in the interview regarding a job where the defendant said he could not figure out how to set up trays. Do you remember that?
He could figure it out, he just didn't want to. First-class trays are harder to put together because they require different kind of utensils and different kind of glasses and different kinds of foods and not the same standard food. I had asked him that because it was a continued concern on his employment reviews. Why didn't he just learn this one thing? And he said it was just too complicated. He didn't want to do that.
Did he say that he couldn't figure out how to set them up?
I don't think, and you have the exact tape, I don't think he said he couldn't figure it out. I just think he didn't want to figure it out.
You kept telling him that he was lazy or distracted by female workers, correct?
I didn't keep on telling him that he was lazy. I don't even think I ever used that terminology. But I did ask him, because one of the things on his employment record that it continued to show was how effective of a team player he was. And I asked him if there are a lot of female workers there.
Now, you're obviously, you've already testified that you're a licensed psychiatrist, correct?
I have my medical license, yes.
You're not a psychologist, correct?
No, I'm not a psychologist.
Do psychiatrists generally administer psychological or neuropsychological tests?
Do they generally do that?
Yes.
I would say not generally. As a treating psychiatrist would you do that, but as a forensic psychiatrist we do.
You didn't do it in this case.
No.
Do psychiatrists typically interpret neuropsychological tests?
Again, forensic psychiatrists do because we're involved in that more. But as a clinical psychiatrist, certain evaluations such as the MMPI or even IQ tests, we have to be able to interpret those in order to treat our patients. We're the ones that actually order those tests. So we have to be able to interpret them when we get those findings.
Now, the context of Calissa Kelly's conversation, it's clear that she did not want to go to the state attorney's office for trial preparation, correct?
I don't know if she did not want to. I don't know that from the content of it.
Okay. Is Kingston College, we've heard reference to Kingston College. That is not a college, it's a high school, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And is it true that Mr. Ritchie said he smoked weed because of his nerves?
No, he didn't say that. He said, when I asked him why he liked, because he told me, I asked him about every drug, and he said he liked marijuana, and I said, well, what do you like about it? And he said, it calmed my nerves. And I specifically then went back to him and said, I thought you told me you don't have any nerve problems. He said, I don't have any nerve problems, but it just really calmed me down. So it gave him, I guess, a level of relaxation. I don't know that I would say it calmed his nerves in the way that maybe you're thinking it, but that wasn't what happened in the interview.
That's semantics, isn't it? What you interpret to be calming your nerves versus what somebody else says calms me down or calms.
Objection, argumentative.
Ro, go ahead, she can answer.
I specifically, because I totally agree with you, Attorney Hernandez, I agree with that, and that's why I specifically asked him it again, because I wanted to be sure I didn't misinterpret what he just got finished telling me, that he has no problems with nerves, not an anxious guy, no problems. Then when he takes marijuana, it calms his nerves. It didn't make sense to me, so I then wanted to make sure what he meant by nerves and what I thought he meant. So yes, I agree with you.
Now, you testified about what happened this morning with Dr. Wu. You understand, based on your observations and your knowledge of Dr. Wu, that he interprets PET scans and MRIs of the brain. At least that's one of the things that he does, correct?
That's one of the things he does, but he's a psychiatrist.
He's a psychiatrist. He's a neuropsychiatrist.
Yes,
correct?
he's a psychiatrist.
Now, is it the case that his testimony that he relies on the interviews that were conducted by Dr. Eisenstein, and did he even in fact refer to that?
He did say that, yes.
Okay. So his function in this case is not to sit down with the defendant and have long questioning of Mr. Ritchie, correct? Because that's not the purpose of his testimony, correct?
But when you get a order for an exam, and as a psychiatrist, as a responsible psychiatrist, you are then going to investigate, is this really needed? What is the real reason why it's asked for? And if they're asking a certain thing, I need to follow up on that.
The purpose of, isn't it the fact that the purpose of the quick questioning was to determine whether there were any symptoms that were consistent with the imaging, correct?
He wanted to ask him things that would support his findings.
Well, no. Pardon me, I'm not. The purpose of the psychologist is to do the extensive interviewing of the patient and in this case, the defendant, correct?
I don't know. You hired those people,
Well,
so I don't know what the
you've heard
purpose was from
testimony
you.
of Dr. Eisenstein, correct?
I heard it, yes.
And he testified that he spent 30-plus hours testing and interviewing Mr. Ritchie, correct?
I would have never guessed that based upon reading the report.
Did you not? I understand the sarcasm, but is it not a fact that that's what he testified to?
That he testified to
That he met with Mr. Ritchie on maybe 8 different occasions and spent 30-plus hours testing and interviewing Mr. Ritchie?
Yes.
Okay. And you also heard the testimony of Dr. Wu that he was provided a copy of Dr. Eisenstein's report, which included the testing and the interviews, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so it would logically lead to the fact that Dr. Wu would not be repeating the same thing and spending all these hours doing clinical interviews, correct?
No, it's not correct. Because I interviewed him, so I would imagine that Dr. Wu, as a psychiatrist, would do a similar thing.
Well, Dr. Wu was testifying specifically about the test results that were provided to him. That was the purpose of his testimony, correct? That's what you heard him testify about.
That's why I heard him testify to his theories about neuroradiology.
I'm not asking you to give me your opinion of what he testified to. I'm asking you, isn't that what he was questioned about, and that was it?
What was he questioned about?
He was questioned about the fact that he was provided MRI results, PET scan results, and to interpret them and determine what, if anything, it signified, whether it showed signs of brain damage or brain abnormalities. That's what his testimony was about, correct?
Yes.
It was not anything dealing with interviews of the defendant, correct?
No, but he added that stuff in there. So once you start adding that stuff, then yes, he's talking about that.
Okay. Now, how many capital murder cases have you been involved in as a witness?
Overruled, go ahead.
How many have I been involved in? I know that I've testified. This is the 14th time.
Okay. And how many times have you testified in capital murder cases in a penalty phase where a defendant has already been found guilty of first-degree murder?
That's all of them.
All 14?
Yes.
Okay. So you've never testified, only in penalty phases in capital murder cases?
I have testified to not guilty by reason of insanity also.
Okay, and I'll get to that in a minute. But, if you could answer that now. How many times have you testified in cases that are not penalty phase, but that have to deal with the issues of mental health issues, such as whether or not a person is guilty or not guilty by reason of insanity?
Well, I've testified approximately 90 times total, so let's subtract the 14 from the 90. So what's that, 76? 76
in non-capital cases and in 14 in capital penalty phase cases.
Yes, 86.
Okay. How many times of those, and let's break each one down, capital murder cases, penalty phase, how many times have you testified for the state?
Every time.
Okay, so you have never testified in a capital murder case for the defense?
No.
Okay. Have you, in insanity cases, How many times have you testified for the state?
To give a percentage, I would say 99%.
And you get paid by the state for your services, correct?
I get paid per hour, yes.
By the hour. What is your hourly fee?
$350 an hour.
You would agree, Doctor, that the state has a steady flow of first-degree murder cases and other criminal cases involving mental health issues, correct?
I don't know if they have a steady flow, but
Well, they've kept you pretty busy, have they not?
I don't know. I'm busy doing a lot of things. The majority of my time is spent treating patients.
You would agree that in many of these cases, the state needs to retain someone like yourself to rebut defense experts, correct?
Yes.
And if the state consistently likes your analysis and testimony, you have repeat business, correct?
Objection, speculation.
I'm going to sustain the objection as to that question, the way it's phrased.
How many cases, Doctor, have you been retained by the state in death penalty cases where you test the defendant and conclude that the mental health mitigating factors or circumstances actually exist and you agree with the defense expert?
That's never happened.
Pardon?
That's never happened.
Never happened. So,
I mean, I agree with certain aspects of what they say, but not the whole thing.
okay, so you have always testified, every time that you've testified for the state or been retained by the state, you have never agreed with the defense experts, correct?
Not in every aspect, but yes. The ultimate aspect, yes. But there are certain things, because there's many different diagnoses, and there's times when I do agree with them.
Have you ever been retained by the state in a case like this, where you evaluate the defendant and go back to the state and say, I can't help you because I agree with the defense that the defendant has brain damage or has significant mental illness?
In a death penalty case?
Yes.
No, that has not happened.
Now, you went into the testing process yesterday knowing that you would be called by the state to testify against Mr. Ritchie, correct?
Well, I knew I was going to be called to testify, yes.
And were you present for the state's opening?
No.
Okay. Would it surprise you if the state opened their case in this penalty phase with testimony or with the statement that you would be called as a state witness to testify that the defendant did not suffer from any mental illness that would qualify as a mental mitigator?
You asked me if I would be surprised at that?
Right.
I don't know. I don't know that occurred, and I hadn't really given him any opinion by that point.
Well, you would. So they said that before you had even evaluated Mr. Ritchie, correct?
I evaluated all the materials that had already been given, but I had not gotten the 3,000 pages from the defense. I had not gotten to interview him yet.
Well, if you had already been listed by the state and the state had already indicated that you would be called as a witness for the state in this case, you would agree that that suggests predisposition to discount mental mitigators, correct?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if there is evidence, and that can be verbal, that can be documented evidence, it would be logical, or do you agree that it would be logical to recommend further testing of the brain?
Can you repeat that question?
If there was information, verbal evidence, verbal information, or documented information or evidence of some type of head injury or head trauma, that it would be logical to recommend further testing.
If the verbal evidence came from the defendant, I would say no.
So, is it your testimony that if the psychologist interviews the defendant and the defendant says, I suffered whatever, I suffered 1, 2, 3 head injuries in my childhood or before the crime was committed, based on that, you don't think that it's worthy to go a little further and do further examination of the brain?
Well, I would do that clinically. So if I thought that I saw something clinically that then indicated that there was some kind of abnormality or some kind of problem, then I would do further testing. So I'm not going to base it just upon what somebody's reporting to me. If I see it clinically, even if they're not reporting it to me, then I would investigate that. But I'm not going to just go based upon what somebody tells me if I don't clinically believe that.
And what if other people are spoken to, people that either family members or friends of the defendant that would substantiate or would corroborate the information provided by the defendant? Would that move you to decide, well, maybe we should do further testing beyond clinical examination?
Not in this particular case, because he's able to manipulate those people around him, which he's already shown. So again, I would have to say, I would base it upon my clinical judgment and that information. If my clinical judgment indicated that I had a concern about that, certainly I would test further.
Would you agree that getting information about a defendant's background and experiences from the defendant and from other people that know him would be useful in finding out more about his situation mentally?
Of course, that's why I asked him that myself.
And you believe that just asking him questions is good enough and move on?
Well, it depends upon what I'm looking for.
Did you talk to anyone, any family members or any other person that grew up with Mr. Ritchie?
No, because I had that entire video of all of these people that were around him.
And again, you don't believe that not following up serves any purposes. You're not seeking, you would agree that it's your testimony that would follow no purpose, correct?
What do you mean not following up? Obviously, I did follow up. I called ComTrain to make sure about what their testing requirements were. So I did follow up on things that I felt that I needed to follow up on.
I'm talking about any type of further testing by someone else besides your interview of him.
What do you mean further testing?
Pardon?
What do you mean further testing?
Such as a neurologist prescribing a PET scan of the brain or an MRI of the brain.
Are you saying I would do that now?
I'm saying that, I assume it's from what you're saying, you wouldn't do that, correct?
Not in this case, because I didn't have any question about a cognitive or intellectual issue.
Would you agree that your testimony, like the other experts that have testified, is, although you're certainly been qualified and you have certain credentials, that your testimony is opinion testimony?
Yes.
And when you do not have a complete analysis, there is a greater risk of error, correct?
Are you saying that I did not have a complete analysis?
I'm saying that you did not follow up with anything besides your own interview of the defendant other than calling this job.
I literally was able to interview him starting at 4:30 yesterday evening. So it is not even 4 now. So that's less than 24 hours. I didn't have months and months and months to consult a whole bunch of different people about this. I literally had 24 hours.
You are not qualified to do any test like the PET scan or the MRI, correct?
No, that's what a radiologist does.
And you would have to make a recommendation that be done before whoever is involved in the analysis or the counseling or the interviewing would have to make a recommendation that be done, correct?
I would have to order it, yeah.
Doctor, have you been accused of being biased and controversial in your professional career?
Of course.
Yes?
Yes.
On more than one occasion, correct?
Yes.
is it true that you once called a defendant an Asian Beavis and Butthead?
I was using that to describe him to the jury so they would understand what I saw in the interview, because he was speaking like one of them and laughing like that. Yes.
Is there another occasion where you said another defendant, of course, different case, that the defendant was not schizophrenic in part because he wore Gucci shoes?
That again, I was talking to the jury about one of the issues with schizophrenia, that people with schizophrenia do not care about their appearance. And this particular defendant actually almost killed an old lady while he was totally dressed in full fashionable gear. And that's not consistent with somebody with schizophrenia.
Well, is it correct that as of December of last year, you have been paid $723,000 by the state for these cases that you've testified in?
I don't know the exact number. I do know that you guys bring it up in every case that I testify in, so that sounds like about a good number.
And before or since December of 2018, before your testimony today, you have testified in 2 particularly high-profile cases for the state, correct?
This year?
Yes.
Yes.
And how much were you paid for those cases?
I have no idea.
Relevance, Your Honor.
Sustain the objection.
Have you been criticized by other mental health experts for your testing procedures and how you conduct interviews?
Sustain the objection, sustain the objection.
Have you ever told a defendant that he or she should want or seek the death penalty based on the crime committed?
No.
May I have one here?
Yes.
Yes, when we approach it.